Hello again, welcome to the third and final installment of the Strategic Human Capital Spring Seminar Series. My name is Rhett Breimer, I'm from the University of Cincinnati. I co-organized this with my colleague John Maudsley at HEC Paris and Samantha Conroy at Colorado State. We have three exciting presentations by three experts in methodologies in strategic human capital today. But before introducing each of them as they I'm going to give just a real quick introduction of today's session. So what we're going to do is have each of them do each of them are going to do 15-minute presentations, and we're going to follow that up with about 5 minutes of Q&A that are specific to their particular topics. After, we'll have a quick break after the second one to refill coffee or whatever you're drinking. We'll do the third presentation, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. If you've attended one of these other two sessions, it'll be somewhat similar to that. We'll randomize you into breakout rooms, and in those breakout rooms, we'll have an open-ended discussion about some of the things you heard about, and there'll be a scribe that will put notes, questions, reactions to anything in a Google Doc, and the presenters will be actually watching this Google Doc, and as we reconvene, we'll react to some of the topics that you all discuss in the breakout rooms. So we'll reconvene then for a discussion and an open-ended Q&A, and then we'll wrap up within a couple hours. So with that, I will introduce the first speaker, who is Evan Starr, who is a soon-to-be associate professor of management and organization at the University of Maryland. And he's going to be presenting on binned scatterplots and two-way fixed effects models with staggered adoption. So without further ado, Evan, take it away.
Thank you, Rhett. I've never been introduced like that before, so grateful. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, can everybody see okay? All right, excellent. So I want to talk about two methods today, and these aren't new methods to strategic human capital per se, but they are super relevant for the things that we do. And so I want to briefly spend about 4 minutes talking about binned scatterplots, and then the rest of my time talking about recent advances in two-way fixed effects models with staggered adoption. And these are super common models that turn out to be often wrong. And so what I'm going to try to get through is why they're wrong, and what we do about it. Okay, so let me begin by highlighting binned scatterplots here, and these are just some sites. I'm happy to share the slides through SMS later. But the start-off point is that we rarely graph our data, and this is a problem. And the reason that is because if you look at these four data sets here, this comes from a paper in 1973 written by a statistician named Anscombe. You can see here that what we have are four very different looking data sets. But if you were to run a regression fitting a line to all of these four data sets, you would actually come up with the exact same relationship, the exact same standard error, the exact same intercepts. Everything would look the exact same. You have no idea that the relationships look quite different. And this is a problem in strategic management generally because 35% of manuscripts show a relationship between X and Y. And among those that do, most of the time what they show are fitted values, in which case all of these graphs would look exactly the same, even though the underlying data are totally different. Moreover, in our review of over 100 manuscripts, what we found is that 94% of papers have continuous independent variables, but they only examine, on average, 1.07 functional forms, and 18% explore sensitivity outliers. And as we'll see, and as these graphs show, those can be important things. And so what we propose is binned scatterplots, which others have really been developing, and we're just kind of diffusing here. And so I just want to talk briefly about how they work. What a binned scatterplot does is it takes a basic scatterplot and it partitions the x-axis into bins. And you can do this in a data-driven or a user-selected way. And then it's going to show the mean of the Y variable within each bin on the X axis. Okay, and so just to look at panel A here, what I have is some data from Olaf Sorensen's data sets on the early computer industry, where we're looking at the sales of a given firm by the number of rival products in the market. And this is just the raw data. This is just the raw scatter plot. And as you can see, there's a lot of dots. There's a positive slope, but it's not, it's really, really skewed. What a bin scatterplot does is it takes all that information, it partitions the x-axis into bins, and then it shows the average y within each bin, and then you can plot confidence intervals around each point, and you can plot confidence bands around the whole bin itself. Okay, and so so this is what the difference between panel A and panel B. Notice the y-axis is dramatically condensed because all of that dispersion is now being brought down into the mean and is being reflected in the confidence intervals. Okay, so this is a nice visual way to see what your data is showing you. You can even include controls. So here's the model, what it looks like when we include year fixed effects in here. You can see the relationship reverses. So there's clearly some stuff going on over time here. You can even smooth within or across bins. And so like, what do I see the real value of bin scatter plots? Well, the first is that they can identify nonlinear relationships quite easily because you can see the actual relationship. You can identify outliers. You can look at subgroups. You can do time trends. Basically, you can start generating richer theory by doing abductive analyses, and you can even test richer empirical predictions. So let me just show you the value of one of these that comes out really clearly in this data set. So here is a look at the data. If you look at R&D expenditures by number of products, okay? And so, if you're thinking about a firm that produces 20 products, out here on the right side of this graph, you would think they might have more R&D expenditures. But if you just ran this raw regression, what you would get is this negative best fit line here, which you can see does a terrible job fitting the data. You'll also notice this enormous confidence interval on the very first bin. And it turns out that this is driven entirely by one company, which is IBM. IBM has one product and they're spending enormous amounts on R&D in this time period. And if you remove IBM, then you can get this very simple, straightforward, very linear looking graph, which is what we would have expected in the first place. Okay, and so the bin scatter plots here help us identify this outlier, which may be of independent interest. We may want to remove it for various reasons, but at least we can identify it and understand what's driving our results here. And then you can also cut this by, by subgroup, in this case, by ownership. You can think about nonlinearities, et cetera, et cetera. So they're super, super valuable, and they're super easy to use. So just one comment on use here. There are two bin scatterplots commands that are out there. One is bin scatter, which is older, was developed in 2014 by Michael Steppner. And the newer one is bins reg. And it's important to highlight that bin scatter will give you the wrong answer when you include controls in your model, and those controls are correlated with your independent variable. So in general, I don't recommend using bin scatter unless it's for purely unconditional models. In contrast, bins reg is the new one developed by Cataneo et al. And this one is by far superior. Not only will you recover the right shape of the relationship, but you can do all sorts of extra testing. It's really, really easy to use. Okay, so in short, show your work. Okay, use these to help really visualize what's going on in your data. The second model method that I want to talk about, and I'll spend most of my time here, are two-way fixed effects model with staggered adoption. And there has just been an explosion of research in these models over the last few years. The papers that I'm listing here are basically all in this year or the last year. So if you've been following this, you know there's a ton going on. And if you haven't, hopefully I'll do a good job of introducing to you what the issue is. Okay, so the starting point here is that we know a lot about basic difference in difference models, right? This is the classic difference in difference model. You've got some control group, some treated group, and then some time period in which the treated group gets treated. And you're interested in this interaction between the treated group and the post period. Okay, and visually we know what this looks like. If you focus here on panel A, what we've got here is a control group who is the red, a treated group who is the blue. There's some pre-period, there's some post-period. And what we can see here is that the treated group goes from 2 to 5. That's a difference of 3. The control group goes from 1 to 2. That's a difference of 1. And so if you go to panel B, that's what we see, a difference of 3, a difference of 1. And so the treatment effect here is going to be 2. And the whole idea is that the control group has played out the unobserved counterfactual of the treated group. So hopefully we're all pretty familiar with that. What we're less familiar about is this model that we also run all the time. It's called a two-way fixed effects model with staggered adoption. And the model looks like this. Imagine you have a panel of firms over time, and you're interested in some human capital practice. Let's say whether a firm has adopted a piece rate payment structure. And some firms adopt it early, some firms adopt it late, some firms maybe never adopt it. And you run a model with firm fixed effects, with time fixed effects. And then you have a dummy variable for your firm adopting a variable pay. Okay, and so then we run this model and we estimate this beta DD here. This is not my notation. So it turns out though, what is underlying this beta DD is actually a weighted average of all the 2x2 different diffs that I just showed you. Okay, and this is the key. And so it turns out if you have k timing groups, that means that if you have groups that get treated at time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, all the way up to k, then you actually have k squared different 2x2 estimates that are going to contribute to this overall estimate. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like visually. So all this is coming from Andrew Goodman-Bacon's recent paper. So here's the simplest possible case. Okay, you've got one group who is treated early. This is going to be this black triangle group. They're treated early. There is a group that gets treated late. Here's the circle group. They get treated over here later. And then there's a group here in the gray that is never treated. Okay, and it turns out with just 3 groups like this, what we have are 4 separate difference in difference estimates. Okay, so let me show those to you. So the first thing you can do is you can compare the early group to the untreated group. That's one. The second is you can compare the late treated group to the untreated group. That's the second one. And then the third thing you can do is compare the early group to the late group. Okay, so here I've got the early ones. And I'm comparing them to the guys who don't get treated till later. And then you have the late group who are being compared to the early group. And it turns out that every single one of these comparisons are underlying that overall point estimate that you get in that beta DD. Okay, so let me run you through just one example and then some simulations about how this really can go awry. So Goodman-Bacon runs through this replication of this paper by Betsy Stevenson about no-fault divorce laws. Okay, you don't need to know the context, but basically what they have here is that they have states adopting these different laws in different time periods. Okay, so here you've got 69, 70, 71, you've got 7 states who adopt in 71, 10 at 73, et cetera, right? So multiple states adopting this policy, and they're going to try to identify the effect of the policy using this two-way fixed effects model. Okay, so he runs this kind of standard diff and diff model that you would get, this two-way fixed, and you would get a coefficient here of negative 3.08. And you can see here, this is what the event study plot looks like. So what Goodman-Bacon's paper is really about is what's underlying this DD coefficient. And what he does is he develops this decomposition theorem where he decomposes that overall estimate into all of those 2x2 differences and their concomitant weights. And he develops a state of command that allows you to scatter them against each other. Okay, that state of command is Bacon decomp. And this is what it looks like in his example. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on here. So let me just explain. So overall here, remember, we have a whole bunch of states getting adopting this policy at different times, right? And so that's what all of the X's and O's and triangles are. These are all of those different comparisons. On the y-axis is each of those comparison point estimates, okay? And on the x-axis is the weight that those point estimates get in the overall difference in difference estimate. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of comparisons here, a lot of 2x2 different diffs that are getting 0 weight. And then there's some that are getting enormous weight. So this one over here, this is a treatment versus pre-1964 reform states. This one is driving a lot of the estimate. Okay, so the first question is like, well, how do these weights get determined, right? Which one is really driving your result? And this is basically the graph that tells you how what's underlying your estimate. And so the weights are generally going to be larger when that subsample is larger. When you have the same size groups, when the group is treated in the middle of the window, those are the ones that are going to drive your results, which is interesting because that means panel length alone can change your estimates, because what's in the middle today may be at the beginning, when we run this again 10 years from now. Okay, so this is just an amazing diagnostic to understand what's underlying your results. But this doesn't tell us what's wrong necessarily with these two-way fixed effects models that we run all the time. And so to understand what's wrong, we need to think about basically when you send n to infinity, where does this point estimate converge to? And so Goodman-Bacon goes further and he shows that this point estimate converges and it has three separate components. The first one is the treatment effect, or it's actually variance weighted average treatment effect. That's the first term here, this VWAT. The second one is the most important, okay? And basically what this is this is the two-way fixed effect version of non-parallel trends in the difference in difference section, okay? And so in this case, remember, there's not a treated and control, there's lots of treated and controls. And so imagine that you have one group who is treated early, and their trends then get compared against all of the groups that get treated later. So when you don't have parallel trends, this can really, really mess you up. Okay, and that's what I want to show you next. So the paper that I think does this the best is Andrew Baker et al.'s paper that's also very recent, where he just runs through several simulations about what can go awry. Okay, so let me show you just a few of these, and then I'll be done. All right, so what he's doing here on the top here is he's showing you the trends of various treatment and control groups, and on the bottom graph he's showing you the histogram of the point estimates that you would get from those simulated trends. Okay, so the data is all fake, so we know what the truth is. And so in the first situation, this is the basic diff and diff. In simulation one here, you've got a treatment, you've got a control. There's parallel trends in the pre-period, and once the treatment hits, then there's a bump up in the treatment group, and you can see from here the point estimate on average is about 2, which is what he made it to be. So that works out well. You can also have a dynamic treatment effect. So here we've got parallel trends, a dynamic treatment effect, and this is also fine. The average here is about 2.9. It's not it's whatever. I think it's going up 1 per year. So there's the trend. Okay, so simulation 3, things get a little more complicated. Now we've got different treatment groups, so different firms adopting these over time, but we only have 3 groups here, so it's not that complicated. And again, we've got parallel trends, and then as soon as you get treated, there's a bump up, and then you stay there forever. And in that situation, also fine, no problem. Okay, it's when things get a little trickier that the problems really happen. Okay, so this fourth one is also, there's a little bit of trickiness. All we have here is we have different effect sizes in different groups, which can also get you messed up. So in this case, the red, the early treated guys have the highest effect. The blue have the medium, and green has the lowest. And what you can see here is that the distribution actually shifts a little bit left. And this is because of that third term I didn't really mention in the that change in ATT in the equation above. But I don't want to really focus on that. So let's focus on the next ones, because these are the really important ones. Okay, so look at what happens when you have staggered adoption, but you have dynamic treatment effects over time. Okay, so in this case, we know the truth, right? The true effect here should be basically 3. But when you look at what you get from estimating just this very simple model, it's close to 0. And the reason this is happening, I'll show you on the next slide, is because we have parallel trends in the very, very beginning. But what happens is this red group starts growing earlier, right? It's the first one that's treated. This then gets compared to the blue line and the green line. And as I showed you with the Bacon decomposition theorem, those both go into the overall point estimate. And because the control group is growing more than because the red line is growing more than the blue line or the green line, that's gonna suggest the treatment effect is actually negative. And that's what pushes this point estimate down to 0. And that actually gets even worse. If the very first time this policy gets implemented, you have an even bigger effect. So here we have the red group having an even larger effect than the blue group and the green group. And you can see that the point estimate can actually flip signs in this situation. Okay, and so I just want to show you one more thing, and then I'll wrap up. So this is a simulation 5 that I just showed you, and what I want to show you basically is what's happening with what I'm calling the Bacon plot. And Andrew Goodman Bacon was a grad school friend of mine. He worked on this paper for like 20 years since we were in graduate school together. So here's what's happening underneath, okay? And it's a little bit hard to follow. So let's just remember, so on the top graph, you're looking at 3 groups, right? The red group gets treated early, the blue late, and the green the latest. But all of the trends are the same. You know, once you get hit, it's just going up 1 per year, okay? And remember, this is really biased. This gets very close to 0, even though clearly every point estimate is positive. And what's happening here, I'll just focus on one of these things. So what Baker is showing you here down below is he's showing you that we're moving away from the truth when we run our 2x2 different diff. So I just want to focus on this one. So check out the treatment. So in this case, we have treatment of 98 versus control of 89, this yellow dot here. So the treatment at 98, okay, that is treatment at 98, that is the blue line. And the control of 89, that would be the red line. Okay, so this means that what we're doing is we're running the different diff where we're comparing the treated group here is blue, the control group is the red one. And what he's showing you are just 2 dots here. The first dot is, so the x-axis is the weight that they get in the Bacon decomposition, and the y-axis is the point estimate. And the blue empty triangle here is the true effect. This is what we should have gotten. And you can see that it's close to 3. Okay. But when you run it when you just do OLS on this 2f(x) mode, you can see that you actually get a negative point estimate. It goes all the way down here to -1. And that happens for all of these comparisons when the treated group is coming before the control group. Okay, so this is what causes the problem in staggered 2f(x) models. You have early treated groups who become the control group for others who get treated later. That's what drives all of the problem. And so there's all of these models now that are all these approaches to deal with this. And the whole idea is to purge those bad comparisons. Purge the comparisons where we have a later treated group that gets compared to an earlier treated group. Okay, and so I just listed them all here. There's like 5 of them. They're being implemented differentially in Stata versus R. And so in Baker et al, he shows, you know, here's what happens when you implement all these and you get the right estimates. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information really quick. Hopefully what you took away is to first graph your data. That shows up here in the second part, and in the staggered different, or the 2A fixed effects staggered different models. The key is that you have to be really careful when you have models where earlier treated units are going to get compared to later treated units. Okay, all right, so that's it.
All right, thanks very much, Evan. So we've just got a few minutes for 1 or 2 questions. So I'm just going to take from the chat. Where are we? So Thomas had a couple of quick questions here on how should we interpret the new diff and diff literature when using only never treated as control groups? And he's citing some famous $1 million plan paper by Greenstone et al. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So again, the basic issue with this is that when you run these 2A fixed effects models, it's when you take those groups that are treated later and you compare them to the earlier group. If you run OLS, that's what's going to happen by default. It's going to happen. And that's where you're going to run into problems. And so all of these approaches, what they're doing is they're just purging those comparisons, and they're doing exactly what you're saying, Thomas. They're trying to compare to the never treated groups, where they're only going to compare the early to the late. Okay, so they're basically trying to purge the bad comparisons that are driving this. And there's different ways of doing it. One way is to do a stacked. Well, so I don't know if I want to go into it, but there's various weighting mechanisms. There's stack designs. There's imputation procedures. There's all sorts of ways that these papers have developed to do it. But if you just compare to the never treated, Thomas, then you should be fine.
One that Denisa's just sent through says that if we do this purging, would this force us to kind of limit our theory development, or maybe think about theory development in a different way?
If you do this, I think that, the question is not really theoretical. It's like, there is some empirical true counterfactual that you're trying to estimate, and the model that you're using is using basically a bad counterfactual when you run OLS. That's the problem. And so it's not, it's just like, what's that counterfactual you want to use? And if you're using OLS, then you're going to get lots of counterfactuals you didn't want actually thrown in there. And so it's just a matter of you figuring out which counterfactual you want and then empirically isolating it. And it turns out OLS doesn't isolate it maybe in a way we thought it did.
Okay. Okay. So the issue is it's on the implications of your findings rather than how you develop the theory.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. One final quick question before we move on to the next presentation. It seems that in your examples, there's an issue with kind of an underestimation of the true effect. Is this always the case, or can purging create issues of overestimation of the effects?
I think it could go the other way as well. I think in the simulations they set it up, but I think if you played around with which groups get treated and who has bigger effects where, you could probably get an overestimate as well. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much. I would encourage people to think about this staggered diff and diff and the research opportunities that this can present. I mean, I know there's work on, out there. So go ahead.
What can I just say, John? What I think this implies for us really is to revisit old work that we may be taking for granted with some of these new methods, but then also to apply it to our own work going forward, just to make sure that we're future-proofing our papers. So.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, wonderful. So it probably has relevance to your non-compete work and all kinds of stuff. So, all right. So let's invite up the second guest. So, Rhett.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. That's some really compelling stuff there. Okay, so next we have Rory Eckardt, who is an associate professor in the School of Management at Binghamton University. And he's going to present on human capital resource emergence and multi-level methods.
Thanks, Rhett. Can everyone see my screen?
We're looking at your presentation mode, not, I don't see the full slide. Maybe that's just me though.
Really?
I can see your outline slides on the left.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not full screen.
All right. That any better or same thing?
That's the same thing.
All right, so we can go with this. Does this work? Can everyone see these? Okay, great. Thank you, Rhett. So what I want to talk about today is primarily multi-level methods as it relates to human capital resource emergence, because I think this is kind of a niche topic area within the area of strategic human capital. I want to start first by providing a conceptual background on HCRE. I also think that for those that are familiar with HCRE, there's still a lot of open questions and points of confusion as well. And so I think it's really important to be clear about at least the stance I'm taking as I'm looking at this from a methodological standpoint. Then I want to take probably the bulk of the presentation and talk about some of the different measurement approaches that have been discussed in the literature. I think this is particularly important because it's very hard to move forward empirically with the studies of human capital resource emergence if we don't have good measurements. Then I'm going to talk about some of the analytical techniques we have to look at some of the emergence enabling factors that are thought to be important to HCRE. And then I want to conclude my talk with just talking about some other multi-level techniques that are relatively new. Obviously, multi-level techniques are really important to study human capital resource emergence, but I also think they have pretty wide applicability to lots of different topics within strategic human capital. Okay, so starting first just with some of the conceptual background. So human capital resource emergence is defined as the transformation and amplification of individual KSAOs into strategically valuable resources at a higher level of analysis. And I think it's really important to note that when we're talking about emergent phenomenon, whether that's human capital resource emergence or really anything in organizations, these phenomenons start from individual characteristics and they evolve into a higher level phenomenon through individual actions and interactions. And so what's important about this? The first is, if we're talking about emergence, something has to be emerging to a higher level of analysis. If we're staying at one level of analysis, it does not involve emergence. Additionally, when we're looking at emergence, when you think about the processes associated with it, the individuals and their characteristics and actions and interactions remain focal. And so you'll see that a lot of these measurement approaches, or even some of the analytical approaches, really start from that foundation of individual components and then works on scaling up from those. So here's a conceptual diagram of human capital resource emergence. As I mentioned, human capital resource emergence is this process through which these individual KSAOs on the left side of the screen here emerge into this, higher level resource, whether or not we're calling that a unit level resource, a team level resource, any sort of collective. The transformation aspect involves changes to the individual KSAOs that happen during the emergence process, and the amplification aspect involves improvements to the value or performance that's derived from those individual KSAOs. So these two aspects, these transformation and amplification aspects, they occur through these emergence enabling mechanisms that are associated with the task and social environment in which the individuals are situated. So the task environment involves workflow structure and task interdependent things like pooled, sequential, reciprocal, group-based workflow structures. And the social environment involves unit level states that pertain to affect, behavior, and cognition. So some examples of these social environment aspects are things like cohesion, shared mental models, climate, trusting environments, unit affect, etc. And I think it's important to point out that many of these social environment states involve emergent processes of their own. And in many cases, these are influenced and shaped by the individual KSAOs of the unit. Additionally, many of these social environment emergence enabling states are interconnected in that specific individuals and their actions can simultaneously influence multiple emergence enabling states all at once. So I think it's also important to point out that this amplification aspect, which involves really synergies and complementarities among the unit members, is really the core part of what is emerging to a higher level of analysis. In many cases, that transformation of the KSAOs is staying at the individual level of analysis. It may be involved indirectly in this emergence process, but the real kind of thing that's emerging to a higher level analysis is really more in this amplification aspect. This amplification aspect has also been suggested to be the one that has the most strategic relevance, as it likely involves more interfirm heterogeneity and isolating mechanisms. So for this reason, you'll see that a lot of these measurement approaches I'm going to be talking about are focused pretty squarely on this amplification aspect. But before talking about those, I want to talk a little bit more about this amplification aspect, just because I think this is an area, and more broadly, the associated notion of synergies and complementarities is something that has often puzzled human capital and really, quite frankly, other management researchers. So when we're talking about this amplification of the KSAO performance link, essentially what we're talking about are increases to the performance that's being derived by a given stock of knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. This really represents this underlying synergistic component of HCRE. This is how we get performance that is larger than that which could be solely attributed to those individual human capital parts, right? That the whole is kind of greater than the sum of the individual parts. So this can take a variety of different forms, this amplification aspect. So, here we can see if we start at some sort of baseline relationship for this human capital performance relationship, that we could have increases in slopes to that, we could have increases in intercepts, then we could have increases in intercepts and slopes. Now, this next slide won't be as interesting because you can't really see the animation because I'm not on the actual slideshow screen. But if you think about it, this bottom level of analysis, so we have a particular unit and we have, let's say, 4 individuals, right? A, B, C, and D. Each one of these has their own human capital endowment. And when we add in these task and social emergence enabling factors, we can see these points increase. And there's a new now intercept and slope to that association. And you can think about that increased area, that kind of shaded area in between those two those two curves as essentially being the emergence that's associated with that amplification aspect. Okay. So in the literature, there really isn't one single agreed upon measurement of this core synergistic aspect of human capital resource emergence, but there are 4 that have been discussed in the literature. These are what I'm calling the multi-level growth modeling approach, the multi-level residual modeling approach, the modified Cobb-Douglas approach, and then multi-level contextual effects models. I think there's a really important need for validation work on these options, and also to compare and contrast the benefits and limitations of these different measurement approaches. Each of them requires kind of particular type of data and particular circumstances. And so there are kind of maybe certain circumstances that are more or less appropriate or conducive towards their use. Additionally, I believe that there's a lot of room for the development of additional measurement approaches. So I think, maybe these inspire kind of new ways of thinking about it. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and talk about each one of these. So we'll start first with the multi-level growth modeling approach. So essentially what this approach does is it uses a series of 2-level random coefficient models, also referred sometimes as HLM, to derive loop-specific estimates of the intercepts and slopes for this KSAO performance link over time. So here's an example of what these models look like with the focal coefficients that are highlighted here. This beta sub 0j and this beta 1 sub 0j. And these can be extracted in the residual files of RCM software programs like HLM. Here's a visual depiction of what these might look like over time. So essentially we've got individual performance and individual KSAOs that are mapped out over time, and you can see these different intercepts and slopes changing. So at the bottom example here, this is a hypothetical example just to kind of illustrate, you see that there's no emergences happening. The intercepts and slopes between the KSAO and performance links staying the same. At the top, it really represents really a high level of emergence where we have increases in both intercepts and slopes. And in the middle one, it's more a moderate level of emergence. So the extracted intercept and slope coefficients that come from those models can then be standardized and combined. And growth modeling then can be used to give you estimates of the degree to which these are increasing over time. A sign that the amplification aspect and ultimately HCRE is occurring. So here's kind of sticking with that same example. We can see in that top unit here that these would show pretty steep increases. The bottom unit that had no emergence would stay relatively flat, and then that middle unit would be about the same. Since I'm not aware of any empirical studies that have actually used this approach, it's been described. I'm not aware of any empirical studies that have actually used it. I pulled together a quick simulation to demonstrate that these models are capturing these intercept and slope changes. So what I did is I simulated data for 30 level 2 units with 30 individuals in each unit, and I did it for 4 time periods. So all started with the same intercepts and slopes, but the KSAOs and level 1 errors were randomly varied across the sample. And then we randomly generated stable modification factors for those unit-specific intercepts and slopes for each unit that were applied to each one of those time periods. And so this can be beneficial, right? Because we can see in certain circumstances, look like there's emergence happening, in other ones it's not. And is this measurement approach being able to differentiate between these? And so this top one here represents a snapshot of some of those units from that simulated data. And then the bottom part here has these intercepts and slope residuals that come from this multi-level growth modeling approach to capture it. And so within here, I've got some instances in which you have large intercept and slope adjustments. This is the level 2 IDs 5 and 20. So these here and these there, and these colors here, lighter colors represent the earlier time periods, and the darker colors represent the later time periods. So we can see in this case of 5 and 20 that we have this amplification aspect happening over time. So both intercepts are increasing and those slopes are increasing. On the complete, and accordingly in this measurement approach down here, you see that it's capturing those components. If we look now on the other extreme, on those that had the lowest intercept and slope adjustments, so these are 17, which actually had no changes purposely, and then 9, which had smaller changes, you see it's relatively flat here, and then a slight increase using this measurement approach. And then for the middle ones, the 2 and 25, we see that this kind of lands in between there. So just again, a depiction just to show that, you know, kind of it does seem to be capturing some of that. Obviously, more work would need to be to kind of you know, look at all the different parameters around when it works better than others, but at least it's a kind of a beginning, you know, example to depict it. Okay, the next approach for measuring human capital resource emergence, this multi-level residual modeling approach. This is a more simplified way to capture these intercept and slope changes. And it really kind of looks at these broader contextual influences on individual human capital. And it uses these intercept-only models in RCM. This approach is also consistent with this idea put forth by Plurhart and Moliterno that human capital resource emergence is a fuzzy composition form of emergence. It's kind of very tightly coupled to that idea. And in these models, which the specifications listed here, this unit-specific residual, this U sub 0 J, is where these contextual influences are being captured, and these also can be extracted from the residual files in a lot of the RCM in a lot of the RCM programs. So if we look here at this, here we go. So if we look at the simulated data again, so I use the same simulated data as before to see if this is doing a similar job in capturing these changes, and it's performing in a similar manner as to how the kind of more detailed multi-level growth modeling approach is working. So the third approach, the modified Cobb-Douglas approach, I think this is a pretty creative approach. Eckardt and Garg did in 2012 in their org science paper, where they took this economic modeling approach to capture complementarities, which is traditionally done with more things like land, capital, and labor. And they applied this to look at complementarities among human capital for a given unit. So with this specification, which is listed down at the bottom here, essentially the residual term from that model captures the interactions among the human capital parts. And then this can be viewed as representing these kind of net complementarities among the human capital. Now, this is a little bit different than the other cases because you need to have an outcome variable that uniquely resides at the higher level of analysis and can't really be reducible down to the lower level of analysis. So examples of this, the Eckardt and Garg paper is a fantastic example of it. If you're not familiar with this article, I highly encourage you to check it out. It's one of my favorite, I think one of the more interesting papers that's in kind of this human capital complementarities area. It's definitely a good place to look at. I also decided to simulate some data as well, just to see if it's functioning as the way that we would expect, and that it's capturing not just these kind of interactions among human capital, which could be thought around more on slope aspects, but is also capturing, you know, changes to the intercept component. And so on the right there, you'll see that there's a comparison essentially of what those modifications were in those interactions and intercept adjustments, and then whether or not the residuals are actually capturing that. And they actually trend pretty well. So it seems to be a pretty effective way to capture human capital resource emergence. There are two important requirements and limitations, though, about this approach. The first is that you need a fixed number of team members and roles across all the higher level units. So they need to have the same number of individuals and the same number of roles. Otherwise, you end up trying to get into test a kind of direct bottom-up effect, which essentially none of our statistical analysis techniques can do a direct bottom-up effect. But if there are a fixed number of team member roles and members, then you can use this approach. The second and a really important component that's required for this is to have a dependent variable that uniquely resides at a higher level of analysis and isn't reducible to the lower level. Okay, moving to the fourth measurement approach, these multi-level contextual effects models. These are particular model specifications that has human capital at level 1 and level 2. And this allows the ability to assess this human capital performance link at both levels of analysis and compare their coefficients. So if the association is stronger at this higher level of analysis, it then suggests that there's underlying synergies among the human capital and that there's an emergent effect. So an example of this, a paper I have with Leah Crocker and Joey Tsai, where we were looking at human capital. We had pretty detailed individual human capital and individual performance data. that we could run these models on. And in these models, you can see, and contextual effects models listed up here, that we have, the association for the individual human capital and performance association, and then we also have this association for the aggregate human capital. So at level 2, so at level 1 and level 2, we can see that here, this association, when you use group mean centering, you can directly compare those. That this association at this higher level is higher than that at the lower level, and there is a significant difference between these. So it's a pretty direct test that there's an emergent effect, that this effect is stronger at that higher level of analysis than the lower level of analysis. A major limitation of these contextual effects models, though, so a big benefit is that they're actually really capturing this emergent component. A major limitation, though, is that these models tell you whether or not there's a presence of an emergent effect in a given sample, somewhere in the sample, but it does not provide point estimates of this emergent effect for particular units. And so then it becomes hard to look at antecedents or consequences if we can't have unit-specific estimates. So after we have kind of specific, measurement approaches for human capital resource emergence, we have a variety of options then to, look at these emergence enabling factors, these factors in the task and social environment, and whether or not and to what degree they're influencing human capital resource emergence. One of these approaches that can be used is multi-level growth models. Here's a kind of generic specification for that, where we would be putting these task emergence enabling factors and social emergence enabling factors at a level 2 and looking at it impacting the trajectory of that human capital resource emergence over time. Those can be interesting ways to look at whether or not they're associated with it, but we have to remember again that many of the emergence enabling states actually involve emergence processes of their own. So to look at the full model, we really need to think about modeling those emergence processes associated with those emergence enabling states. There are some relatively new models that do this pretty well. Consensus emergence models are a good example of ones that have a kind of consensus component to them. And then the broader class of location scale models also, I think, has applicability. But remember, too, that it's not just that there's the emergence enabling states have their own emergence processes, but these emergence enabling states are also interconnected and simultaneously occurring. So you could think about an action that's happening in a unit, both impacting trust and affect and potentially cohesion and probably climate and a whole bunch of other things, depending on how severe or kind of significant that interaction is. So for some of these, we need to really model those interconnections and kind of look at them simultaneously. That's challenging. I think recent developments around dynamic structural equation modeling offer some benefits for that. Here's a depiction, for example, of this complexity, right? So if we're just looking at the influence of, let's say, leadership on the human capital resource emergence process. So let's say we just isolated 3 emergence enabling states. Well, each one of these processes could have complicated dyadic associations kind of within and between levels. And we might have to model these all at the same time, right? So there's a lot of complexities that go into that. So to model the entire human capital resource emergence process, I don't think we have really one turnkey analytical technique for that. One approach, though, that I think has quite a bit of potential is computational models and agent-based simulations. So these provide good traceability and specificity in the theorizing. They're also helpful ways to demonstrate and explore associated multi-level processes, mechanisms, and dynamics. And if you feel like our theories are perhaps incomplete, just try to build a computational model of them, and you'll realize just how severely underspecified most of our theories are. It's pretty remarkable. But besides helping on the kind of theorizing side of things, there are also several options to empirically validate these computational and agent-based approaches, both ones that kind of carve out particular parts of the model and look at those empirically, as well as ones that kind of try to do it all within the same modeling framework. So here's just a quick example of a current project that I have on this. So this is building an ABM for the human capital resource emergence process. So essentially we're starting with a production process model, and we have kind of inputs and works in progress, that units that are flowing through the various activities and buffers to generate output units. And then we're overlaying and integrating an agent-based model to allow these agents to interact with these activities and other agents and team members. in the production systems. And so this allows for modeling changes to the KSAOs over time and factors impacting their deployment, things like motivation, colleague dyad learning, et cetera. It also allows to incorporate networks as important conduits for learning and influence, and allows for extension in these all sorts of different sub-emergence processes that you could connect into those aspects. So our plan on this is that once we're done with the model, we want to make this model and code available publicly for others to use and build on after we conclude the project. Our view on that is that it's often hard to get a base model. And so our hope is that by building that base model and making it publicly available, that then more may try to use those. Last thing I'll say is that I've mostly been talking about things related to human capital resource emergence and some of the multi-level techniques around there. There are, two relatively recent resources, though, that if you want kind of other multi-level techniques that may have applicability to a variety of strategic human capital aspects, James LeBreton and Stephen Humphrey's 2019 Multi-Level Handbook, I think, is excellent, has a lot of new kind of interesting techniques. There's also a multi-level issue in ORM, just this last issue. And in both of these include a number of interesting analytical techniques related to multi-level networks, multi-level dynamics, dyad level analyses, multi-level mediation, survival analyses, meta-analyses, and also issues around endogeneity. So I definitely encourage you to check those out. And if you're new to multi-level approaches, I'd be careful though about diving straight into these more complex techniques. Instead, I think I'd start with kind of the basics. After mastering those, then kind of move on to the more complex approaches. So that is all I had. Thank you. I do have a link to a document that lists some of the references that I noted here, as well as some additional readings there. I'm going to put that in the chat box.
Yeah, I just did, Rory. Yeah, thank you very much. And
then also, in terms of starting back at the basics, I do have on my website a list of multi-level modeling references. I'll put those there. It's a bit outdated, but a lot of the kind of traditional works are referenced there.
All right, excellent. Thanks very much for that, Rory. Right, we have a stack of questions for you, Rory, that we're not going to get a chance to go through in this next 5 minutes. So maybe you get a chance to go through them a little bit more when Denise is presenting. But I'm going to pick on just a few here. So David was the first to ask the question. So David basically asks that you seem to be modeling this kind of relationship between KSAOs and performance with different assumptions, but you're not necessarily measuring what the kind of emerged human capital resource is. Do you have any insights how maybe we can get more directly to that aggregated human capital resource?
So perhaps you can clarify, DK. So what do you mean by not actually capturing the emergence of the human capital?
So you've got some individual measures, and you're creating some kind of aggregation assumptions. So maybe you're summing or you're averaging your individual measures, and then you're looking at the correlation between performance under different assumptions. And so the actual resource itself, it seems to be an assumed phenomenon that you're sort of backing into based on the relationship between your aggregated KSAO measure and performance. And so I'm wondering if you've thought about, are there different ways to actually measure the unit level resource without sort of inferring the existence of the emerged human capital resource from just a summation of the individual scores?
Yeah, thank you, DK. So what these techniques are trying to do are tease out and measure that part that is that synergistic, that complementarity part, right? The part that is allowing you to get more out of that than just those individual components. So it's separating that part out.
It's putting a lot of pressure on the residual, right? It's like the unexplained relationship between the individual. You're basically doing an aggregation of individual scores to come up with your unit level measure of human capital, and then observing how that relates to performance outcomes.
So some of it may be residuals in the context of multi-level models, can mean different things, right? So at the level 2 for the residual there, essentially what you're getting is unit specific estimates of those intercepts and slopes. So they're not necessarily unexplained. They're more about the unique components of those intercepts and slopes to that. So they're not necessarily unexplained aspects. But, you know, part of this is, you know, for me, I think human capital is inherently an individual resource. I think when we really talk about what is emerging, right, there has to be something outside of the individual, right? There has to be some sort of contextual influences, those sort of aspects. And I mean, my own view is like when we simply take the sum of individual human capital, it's probably not sincere to call that unit level human capital. We probably should call that aggregate individual human capital. The part that is at that higher level of analysis are those synergistic components. And so typically when we think about those synergistic components, right, or complementarities, they're the interactions, right, between those. Well, what are those interactions doing? They're changing the slopes, right, of those relationships. And what we care about mostly, right, are those slopes increasing over time, right? I think there was a comment about kind of the slopes decreasing, and I agree, right? Those are really interesting areas that, with maybe a few exceptions, we haven't really talked about as much, right? But those can be even worse, right? And this idea that a negative event can have up to 5 times the effect size of a positive, right? I think those are important things to do. But it's trying to tease out, and how do you measure that complementarity and kind of all the different ways that it can come about from those contextual influences. So it's that unique component that is just due to those differences in those units or in those intercepts or slopes.
All right, good. So I think we used up all the time there on David's question, but that was great. It was a great question and a really great answer. So the remainder of the questions, Rory, if you get a chance to take a look, the rest of the presentations, that would be great. So Rhett, I'm going to hand back over to you.
Let's go ahead and get started with the second half of this seminar. I'd like to introduce Denisa Mindruta, who is the Associate Professor of Strategy at HEC Paris. And she's going to present on structural matching methodologies. So with that, take it away, Denisa.
And thanks everyone for being here. I've seen so many familiar faces, so it's really great to present among friends. This may not be new to you, but thank you for being part of the seminar. So this crowd is really familiar with the main questions that we ask in human capital literature, but let me narrow in on a few questions that are relevant for what I'm gonna present you here. So what do we ask? What do we want to know? We want to know how CEO characteristics influence firm choices and outcomes. What is the added value of a star employee to firm performance? What is the role of employee mobility in knowledge transfer? How do firms compete for talent? And in general, whether firms can gain competitive advantage through people. So I really pull this out from the Strategic Human Capital website. All right, so what you can notice here is that all of these questions focus on the treatment effect, the treatment effect being the influence of human capital on some sort of firm outcome or characteristic. Yeah. But what's happening here is that most of the time when we try to answer this question, there's this selection that raises its ugly head, and then we get a lot of pushback from the reviewers on questions related to selection, because people don't end up in organizations randomly, right? And then we have this problem of confounders, which are factors that affect both the hiring of people with a profile of interest, the treatment effect, and the outcome of interest. Then the usual suspects, obviously, when we talk about human capital and firms, are the firm's attributes, and also the complementarity between human capital and firm types, something that Rory has alluded to in his presentation. So what happens if we do not account for these confounders? Then the treatment becomes endogenous, and that leads to inconsistent estimates. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into what happens in one of the classic problems that we analyze in human capital, the hiring decision. right? So I think we can all agree that hiring are subject to mutual preferences of individuals and firms. And these preferences are related to the benefits that both parties perceive when they engage in a transaction in this hiring process. And what the problem is that because of this expectation, because the relationships are formed based on expectations, then these preferences for whom to hire and which firms to join will be correlated with the outcome of interest. And that gives rise to that problem of endogeneity of treatment, right? So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is that in most labor market settings, there's going to be competition. Firms will compete for individuals, and individuals compete for firms. So this is, we can refer to this process as a matching process. So what I will do in this presentation is to then tell you how we can deal with such situations, right? Is there a theory of matching? I want to emphasize one more time that this should not be confounded with synthetic control statistical methods, which we are all doing when we want to compare a treatment group with a control group, and we want to build them to be as similar as possible with each other, except for the, for the treatment of interest. There's an entire theory of matching, is foundational work, which has been done to analyze labor markets, marriage markets, and more generally partnership formation. And Roth and Sotomayor have a wonderful overview of this early work, and they analyze, for example, college admission, placement of medical residents. So it's a general problem of which the labor market problem is just one aspect. These are mature models that accommodate many situations in which we're going to see one-to-one matching, many-to-one, meaning that one entity, one firm can hire multiple individuals at the same time. A boss can form a partnership or put together a team with many individuals at the same time. And there are many variations of these models with payments or not, preferences or not, and matching can be centralized or decentralized. Centralized when there's an algorithm that assigns how agents can match, and decentralized when this occurs through the invisible hand of the market. Okay, so what's the template here? Well, we're gonna have a two-sided market, meaning that there are two defined sides, men and women, CEOs and firms, principal investigators and the individuals they work with. And agents on each side of the market are endowed with characteristics. And what's important here is that they are in competition for partnering with the preferred agents on the other side, right? Even if when we have one-to-many matching or many-to-many, there's some point a capacity constraint that leads to competition across agents on each side of the market for getting their preferred relationship on the other side of the market. So what do we want to know? Well, we want to understand how the attributes of agents combine into the joint output. In other words, we want to understand what the drivers of value creation are. And the simplest way to think about this value creation function, which is also the matching function, is that is a function of combination of the attributes of the agents on the two sides, right? So what we want to estimate are these combinations of X and Y that drive the agents matching. What's complicated here is that matching actually leads to sorting in the market. And this is a very important aspect. And if there's one thing that I would like you to remember today from my presentation is that whenever there's matching, there's sorting. And this sorting can be characterized, mathematically speaking, very elegantly by looking at the distinction between complementarity and substitution. In other words, if two attributes are complements, they reinforce each other. It's the synergy that Rory has mentioned before. Then what we're going to see is top-down sorting, meaning that agents who fare best will form a relationship together, leaving the other agents who score lowest on the dimensions that that characterize this complementarity to select each other. And if there's substitutability, then the highest or the best will match with the weakest or the least, because that's what creates more synergies here. Okay, so if we have this sorting in the market, what I depicted here are just examples of unidimensional sorting, where we look at one attribute on each side of the market. So we look at CEO prestige and firm size, and we know that this top-down sorting, this is a very well-established relationship that most prestigious CEOs match with largest firms, and the other way around, largest firms with most prestigious CEOs, right? But what complicates things is that obviously CEOs are not only characterized by prestige, and first not only by size. So we have multidimensional matching, which is then very, very complicated to uncover. And it's also very, very complicated to characterize. We're not going to have the simple top-down sorting if there are more dimensions that matter in the matching process. Which means that because of this sorting, it's very difficult to apply our usual methods where we look at discrete choice models such as logit and probit. So in a paper that I co-authored with Makamoy and Raji Agarwal, we gave the details of why these methods fail. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of the details here. But the idea is that, you know, intuitively, I might like a certain partner, a firm or an individual, but that partner may not be available to me in the market. So it's very difficult to infer preferences from partner choice, because these choices are done under market or competition constraints. And I'm going to skip these slides, but it's just, and everyone will have access to my slides afterwards, but I just present here what some of the limitations of prior methods are. And we also, in the paper, we also have simulations, and we show how poorly these discrete choice models behave, particularly because what we need to explain in a matching situation are not dyadic choices, but actually market-wide configurations. And that's why it's very difficult to come up with good estimates. Okay, so but then what can we do in these situations? We observe in observational data, we have information on who has been hired or who formed a partnership with whom. What can we do? And what I will do here in the remaining of my presentation, I'm going to just go quickly over one example that shows you how we can deal with this difficult problem. And this is based on Jeremy Fox's non-parametric method. Basically, what it says that let's assume we observe two matches, one being Satya Nadella being hired by Microsoft and Sundar Pichai being hired by Google. What matching theory predicts is that the value, the expected value that Nadella and Microsoft expected to create at the time when the hiring took place, plus the expected value that Pichai and Google anticipated to create, should be higher than the counterfactual, where Nadella would be hired by Google and Pichai by Microsoft. So this is a very elegant way of moving from the theory to the empirics, and by writing these inequalities, we can actually estimate what type of attributes are driving their matching, right? And we did this in a recent paper with my co-authors, and which you can find at the SMJ. So Goli, Sterling, and Philip, we were together asking a classic treatment question. How does the nature of CO human capital, generalist versus specialist CO, affect firm acquisition and performance? And in order to ask that question, we needed to understand which sets of CO firm attributes drive the matching of COs and firms. So we needed to solve this selection issue. And in particular, we were interested in understanding what firm level attributes are complementary to the generalist CO dimension. So how did we do that? Well, we start from a specification of a matching function when we ask the question, do firms of larger size prefer to higher CO prestige? In other words, are there synergies between prestige and firm size? Are there synergies of complementarities between a CO generalist and firm operating in multiple segments, or firms with a more important acquisition performance, or firms that are run by generalist boards? And then we also look at other relationships which are listed here, like CO prestige and Tobin's Q. And we had some theory to guide us when we chose this model, obviously, and we discussed those in this theory in the paper. What's interesting to observe here is that the matching is driven entirely by the interaction between the attributes of the partners, so we don't have main effects, and we also, which they will cancel out in the inequalities. And in general, if a coefficient is positive, it means that two attributes are complements, and if the coefficient is negative, they are substitutes. Okay, what we did, we have data on S&P 1,500 firms, 175 hiring events. We had to establish what a matching market is, because obviously those of you who know the details, Nadella and Chai have not been hired at the same time, so that's not a relevant example, as a matter of fact. So we considered a matching market, all hiring events taking place in an industry year. And we commented why, and we wrote that inequality that we've seen before, and we got 5,132 inequalities. How we could do that, we use a differential evolution maximization method in order to write these inequalities, and then to obtain the coefficient estimates to maximize the number of inequalities predicted, because this is what gives us the coefficient estimates. And then in order to test whether the estimates were significantly different from zero, we generated confidence intervals. What do we get? Interesting enough, generally CEOs seem to be complementary to generalist board. So that was the only relationship that turned out to be significant here. That includes, the generalist CEO attribute. Remember, this was the treatment effect that we were after, right? So it's clearly we have here a complementarity between these two attributes of human capital, right? So more generalist board prefer more generalist CEOs, and the other way around, which means there's going to be a sorting here in the market. So more specialist board will match with more specialist CEOs. Right, so then the model fit is, and we did many controls. The model fit is quite good. We explain 81% of the inequalities. And another interesting result is actually that even though we did all this matching exercise, as you can see it on the right side of the of my slide, the relative importance of these complementarities is actually very small relative to a baseline complementarity, which is the well-known relationship between CEO prestige and firm size. And then we we did many things in the paper where we combine matching with propensity score matching and other methods to answer our treatment question, meaning how do generalist CEOs engage in acquisition, on what type of acquisition, and what is their performance. Okay, so here are additional applications. I think I've seen Florence here in the audience. She also has a very interesting paper that is also about hiring. She's using a different matching method with different assumptions. She's looking at entrepreneurial firms' acquisition of talent. I strongly encourage everyone to look at that paper. The main takeaway, don't let the selection raise its ugly head, would be my message to you. Two-sided matching models can capture fundamental behavioral assumption in partnership formation, mutual preferences, competitive nature of partner selection, and ultimately sorting in the market. So I strongly encourage you to embrace selection rather than control for it, as we typically do. In concrete terms, what you can do, there's a GitHub link here to this to the code that you can use, but you will have to know Mathematica. We are actually working on R code, but there are some limitations in R, and we hope to overcome those. If you, for the moment, the Mathematica code works very well. You just need to prepare your data in Stata, and it runs in a few minutes. So my final remarks, matching is prevalent in many interactions. When you suspect selection, think about matching. And actually the most important takeaway is that these methods are great, not because of the econometrics and not because of the software, but because of the fundamental theoretical assumptions behind those. So it takes a little bit of time to understand what these people have said in their models. But happy to share with everyone and engage and help you as you want to do some of these estimation methods based on inequalities. And then I think you need to go to Florence for other methods.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Denisa, for that. So there's some questions in the chat box. So I think it's going to be easier if I let Clint quickly ask his question first, and then after that, Evan, if you can just select one of your questions that you posted there, we'd rather push on time. So Clint, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, sure. And this is a very broad question, Denisa, so you may not have a good response right away, but I do like the idea of two-sided matching, and I think a lot, at least in a superficial level, there's a lot of work in micro HR and OB on similar themes. The methods are very different, but there's a lot of quote unquote matching kind of work, like person organization fit on the micro level. And I wonder how much that what you're doing could be informed by that and enriched by some of the things that they've been finding there for quite some time.
Right. So I think, Clint, this is a very important question, and there's room for linking this newer literature that uses more sophisticated empirical work with some classic insights from what we knew from personal economics and a individual fit. What I would say is that we have to be a little bit careful here in terms of how do we think about competition, right? So what I showed you a classic example of labor market competition where both firms compete for CEOs and CEOs compete for firms. Right inside the firm, then firm can have the liberty to experiment more with this and mix and match individuals in different way. And it's only, let's say, the firm that there's a central authority that decides where individuals should be assigned to what type of task, or even who should work with whom. In these circumstances, the models that I showed you are useless. Right? Because there's a central authority, there's no mutual decision, and there's no competition there, or at least there's no competition in both sides of the market. right? And that's why they are not useful. So I think we can continue to use the old frameworks. Well, I mean the classic frameworks without any problem, as long as there's a central authority who decides, as opposed to being some sort of competition on both sides of the market, right? So even let's think about how we buy a house. Right, I mean, there's going to be competition between buyers, but the house doesn't, house itself doesn't choose us. So we can think about but then we can extend that example and say, well, but it's not the house who's choosing, it's the seller. So is there a competition between sellers and buyers, right? So it depends on how we see the problem.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that, because I do think that the classic stuff does have kind of both sides going on, but it's not exclusively a market kind of phenomenon. But one thing that your comment points to that may be something to play with is the degree to which there is disproportionate power between the two sides of the transaction. And that's something I want to chew on. But anyway,
right.
I'll let somebody else ask any other questions.
Interesting thoughts, yeah.
All right, very quickly, I'm gonna do moderator's prerogative and defer away from Evan. Sorry, Evan, because the questions just come through from Ulya, and Ulya's asking, is the two-sided matching method able to determine the second order, third order, etc., cascading matching preferences? For example, if my first choice match is not available, then I might go to my second or third. So basically, it can account for some kind of rank order preference.
That would be difficult, Ulya, without putting some structure on, I mean, exactly structure on what you want to model. But having said that, maybe there is a way of getting to that question, because what we get at the end of the day, we get some estimates of the matching function, right? Of the and what we can do then, you can go back to the data and play and say, okay, had I been better on this attribute, could I have gotten a better partner or a better firm? Could I have been hired by someone better? So not necessarily, I mean, if we don't know what the ranking of preferences are ex ante, we can never say if you get the first or second or third. But what we can do with these coefficient estimates is it's then play and say, okay, this is these are my attributes. Given that matching is so for example, in the CEO firm size market in the CEO firm hiring, we've seen that CEO prestige and firm size are so important. So then the question we can ask, well, if a firm would have the larger size, how much would have mattered? What type of COO would have gotten in terms of prestige, right? So, and that, can be extrapolated to understand what type of attributes one should invest on if it wants to, let's say, to hire a prestigious CEO. And sometimes we can say that it's not even possible, right? The resources that are needed are very difficult. So that's the competition in market, in a matching market.
All right, thanks. Incredible presentations there and some really great questions and answers. In the chat box there, I've just put in again the Google Doc. So if everyone can please open that Google Doc. What we're going to do now is we're going to put everyone into breakout rooms. So Robin from SNS has already pre-allocated people. Our guests will stay in the main room and monitor this Google Doc. And what we want you to think about in your breakout groups is not so much kind of technical questions about, what do we do with a particular method, but think about research questions, research opportunities. How can these methods really kind of help us think about answering questions for the next 5 or 10 years of our research? All right, everyone. So people are coming back now. So we didn't have a huge amount of time in the breakout rooms, and I think we had a kind of a mechanical thing. So lots of people focused on Evan because it's the first things that we see. So as well as what's in this Google document, and maybe you guys can also have a quick look through the chat. And if there's anything interesting that pops up in the chat, then feel free to explore that as well. So we have about 15 or so minutes left. So let's start with Evan. Okay, Evan, so you can take a few minutes just to pick some things up to explore a little bit more.
You know, I don't have a lot to say on these actually. I mean, my view is that if you have a continuous independent variable and you are going to run OLS or even a logit or probit, then you should show a bin scatterplot in your paper. You should see what that relationship looks like. From the reviewer perspective, I think it gives us confidence that what we're seeing is real and not manufactured by some you know, outlier or something weird going on in your data set. I think that it also, as a researcher, is if it's one of the first things you do, you can see, you can believe it yourself. You know, that something is really there. And if it's not there, if it's driven by something weird, then you can update and move on. So I think, you know, people who say they should, the Yakult group, which I've never had that drink before, said it should be incorporated in their usual methods. Yes, absolutely. Like, please, like, show us the data. We'll believe you more. And I think you'll do better research. Somebody wrote, you know, staggered DD and huge opportunities to examine policies that interchange at different times by different firms. Absolutely. I think that in the next 10 years, there will be a, you know, a mini revolution in how these are presented in the diagnostic tools that we use. So if you are going to, if you're reviewing a paper like this and they're running a, you know, staggered adoption to a fixed effects model, which many of them do because we have this great panel data, then ask them to do the Bacon decomposition. You know, see if all of those 2x2 different diffs are, if they're all the same, or if they're really heterogeneous, or if one of them is driving the whole thing, right? This is all just helping us understand the data. So I couldn't agree more that these both of these methods give us a chance to do better research, to make sure that others are doing the higher quality research. And I think that they, you know, I think they'll be a really important part of our toolbox for the next, you know, forever. I don't know, maybe not forever. That's a bold prediction. I won't live to see if that's true or not, but at least for the next several years, for sure.
I just got a quick point on that staggered diff and diff. So given that there's no real consensus in the literature over kind of how to do staggered diff and diff, right? So the literature hasn't got there yet. I mean, does that present opportunities? Does that present challenges? I mean, if as a reviewer, if something lands on your desk or you're trying to write a paper, I mean, what approach should you take? Yeah,
so I think at this point, there's like 5 different options you could take. Okay, so I would lay, you know, so there's various ways to reweight things, which are some of the estimators. Some of them rely on imputation. Some of them rely on stacking the data in certain ways to avoid the kind of bad control groups. And so all of those have, you know, various assumptions baked in. The easy thing is, honestly, that these are all baked into Stata or R already. So you can ask for a few of them and just say, you know, make the graph this way, do it this way, you know, ask for a few, and I think they should all look about the same. I imagine at some point there'll be a consensus on which ones are better or not, but at this point in time, knowing that there are a few of them out there, and just, I mean, I would just ask in the review report, just like, hey, can you run the Callaway Santana one, or, you know, just pick one of those. And the key is to be aware of the issue and make sure it's not driving the results of the paper, or that things don't change dramatically once you start to incorporate it.
All right, great. Rory, I think you're writing furiously away there. Do you have points that you'd like to pick one?
Yeah, so it doesn't look like there's a lot of comments in the chat, but maybe some, or at least comments from the Google Doc. But maybe I can follow up on some of the other comments that were made, you know, while I was presenting and after that. So one of there's a couple comments I think about, you know, can some of these techniques capture both kind of dyssynergies and those components? Yes, it can. I don't know if I can still share my screen. But I actually had an extra slide that's on this. So as much as you could think about the amplification side being like increases to those intercepts and slopes, we also can see and think about them as being decreases to those intercepts and slopes, and we can model those using many of these techniques. And I think there's tons of interesting work in that area, and really there's few mentions of this. I mean, I think Rhett, your chapter in Anthony and Tom's handbook, I think is one of the few that really talks about discomplementarities. But I think they're present, unfortunately, a lot, and I think they can have huge impacts. And even if we just think about, like, there's asymmetries between the concept of trust and distrust, right? Like, being in a distrustful environment, right, is different and like much more toxic than just being in a low trusting environment, right? And these could have, really huge impacts. Additionally, like, these negative events, like, they may happen in really small points of time, right? It may be like one small interaction that cascades over time, right, into these huge problems and all these other sort of areas. So yes, I think it can, capture those. I think Sekou had a comment about, needing really individualized, detailed data. Yes, unfortunately, that's a problem with a lot of multi-level work, and particularly in a lot of work on emergence. And Steve Kozlowski, for example, has talked about this, quite a bit, about why have we been hearing calls for lots of, research on emergence and bottom-up effects, but we don't actually see any of the empirical studies. And he says, well, because it's hard. And it's really difficult to get the data. It's difficult to get it longitudinally. You need that data at multiple levels of analysis, right, to do a lot of these. But I do think it's getting better, particularly with a lot more digital traces that are out there, more wearable sensors, more big data, and those things. So I think it's a lot better now than it was 10 years ago, and I suspect it will continue to increase. I think Evan had a comment about essentially dealing with endogeneity with a lot of these models. Yeah, there's a lot of work to deal with endogeneity in this. There's, in all multi-level techniques, really, we have just barely scratched the surface on how to deal with that. Really, there's only really two people I'm aware of that really spent a lot of time working on that, and that's Dan McNish and John Antonakis. John Antonakis has a paper in that ORM special issue that talks about it a little bit. But in the intro paper to that special issue, we talked about how we just have tons and tons of work. I mean, thinking about what Denisa was talking about with selection, right, and matching issues, right? Like, there's no really thought about that in a lot of those areas. So there's a lot of work for that. In there. I also think, I don't know how much all of you have followed the new general cross-lag models, the work by Mike Zephyr and colleagues. These are really, really interesting models that I think once multi-level extensions are added for them, they're going to allow us to do a lot of things and also deal with a lot of potential endogeneity issues. So if you're not familiar with those, I would encourage you to check them out. They're actually they're a two-part paper in ORM with Mike Zephyr and colleagues. And he also has a great video where he walks through and explains them. They're really, really cool, particularly in looking at dynamics and short-term, long-term effects, and dealing with a lot of potential, threats to causal inference.
So Rory, real quick, can I just put up Sekou's question, which is, you've talked a lot about, or you talked a little bit about some of the limitations of these four different general methods or ways of thinking about the data, modeling the data. Is there somewhere you could point us to how to choose between them if we are thinking about emergence?
Yeah, so that actually is a working paper, and that's what those simulations are starting towards, because, and what we also want to look at, like, was how does this deal with increases and decreases, right, to intercepts and slopes? How does this deal with if your KSAOs are changing as well? How about, nonlinear aspects, right? We're assuming they're linear, but they are likely not linear. Dealing with confounds and covariates, right? There's all sorts of considerations. I think the first thing to think about with that, though, and as part of that, we have a table we're working on that kind of helps guide you, right? So what sort of data you have, which ones may be appropriate, et cetera. I think a lot of it depends on what sort of data you have. So if you have detailed individual performance and detailed individual human capital data, then I think some of the RCM-based approaches can be good places to start. If you have data where if you don't, let's say you just have individual human capital, but you don't have individual performance, maybe it's because of the nature where you're working, you just have a upper level, then I think the modified Cobb-Douglas approaches are really good techniques to look at. And they have a long tradition in economics of being looking at with complementarities. And maybe I wasn't completely clear on this point, but I think it's important to at least take my stance on it. I view complementarities as an inherent fundamental part of human capital resource emergence. Like I think these two concepts are tightly coupled together. And so anything that's looking at complementarities, right, potentially has, application on it. But I mean, what I hope is, in general, I don't think we have enough multi-level research in human capital, right? So lots of calls, right? Lots of, quite frankly, expressions and interests, but there are very few empirical papers, right, that actually start doing this, and particularly in the human capital resource emergence phase, right? And so my take on this, the approach I've been trying to do is put out there what I think makes sense, right? But I'd like everyone to contribute to that, right? Because there are lots of good ideas out there, right, that I think that can contribute, and by collectively working on it, I think that's how we improve, as a whole field.
All right. Thanks, Rory. So we have a few minutes left that we're going to dedicate to Denisa to give her final thoughts.
Yeah, so there were some interesting points here in the chat and in the discussion. I don't know if I'm going to have time to address all of them, but I'm going to save the chat and then answer to you individually. But there's one issue here that is actually very important: the need to have a theory. So Guinness mentioned that it's interesting to model the matching process, but concerns, lots of assumptions are required for the empirical exercise. Having a theory will be helpful. So compared with agent-based models that are motivated by theory. So I'm gonna disagree here that they are not motivated by, matching models are not motivated by theory. Of course they are, but it's a different way of thinking. And it goes back to what Rory said. The fundamental question that we are asking there are, what are the complementarities that drive these matching processes, right? And what's interesting is that, let's say in a manager-employees relationship, the manager can experiment and can think about different type of synergies between workers, or between the boss and the workers themselves, or between the workers and a task. And there's something that can be done there by mixing and matching and making different decisions. But in situation where there should be mutual, mutual choice, things with alternative ways of matching, this is where things become complicated. But there are complementarities there that drive the decision as well. So as long as we have a theory about what type of complementarities we expect, then we can actually run matching models. And I would say that the most difficult part there is to actually think about the nature of complementarities across agents on the in different sides of the market that are transacting each other. And also it's difficult to think about the multidimensionality of this complementarity. This is something that, even if we accept that the discrete choice models can help us when there are extreme market frictions, it's very difficult to tease out these multidimensional complementarities, because they lead to that sorting. So what the entire literature has done was to think about homophily, for example, as a we can think about top-down sorting as a homophily example, but that's about it. What happens if there are multiple dimensions, and on some you prefer someone like you, and on others someone that is different than you? How does the market sort out these preferences, right? And it's very difficult to sort out preferences under constraints. So I would say that it's very important to start with these considerations, like look at the literature that has considered heterophily and homophily, and literature that talks about complementarities. And once you have a theory about why two factors should be complementary, then you can think about matching models, right? And I think like, Evan told me before that why is it that we are not using AKA models? Just dealing with fixed effects, it becomes very complicated when you want to understand multidimensional sorting and multidimensional complementarities. So these words you may not have the time to process these words, but once you get into the literature, you understand why they are important. And I hope they will resonate with many people who are doing work in human capital, because this is where we can see this.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, especially our experts, Evan and Rory and Denisa. Thank you so much for 3 really interesting and compelling presentations, really thought-provoking. Thank you all for all you participants for coming. We hope that you enjoyed this and the other spring seminar series. If you'll notice in the chat, Robin put a survey for feedback. John and I and Samantha did this this spring. It was the first spring we did this, and we really appreciate your feedback for potentially subsequent springs. So hope to see you all in September at the SMS annual meeting. And for all of us in the North America, have a great summer, and hope to see you around.